The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat in her private sitting room, staring at the newspaper headlines that had become her daily torment. "Princess Charlotte's shocking behavior," screamed the front page of yet another tabloid, accompanied by a photograph that made her heart sink deeper into despair. Charlotte, her beloved 8-year-old daughter, had once been the picture of royal perfection. With her bright smile, polite curtsies, and charming wave to the crowds, she had captured the hearts of millions around the world. The public adored her spirited personality balanced with impeccable manners, seeing her as the future of the monarchy wrapped in innocence and grace. But something had changed over the past 6 months. Something so profound and unsettling that it kept both Catherine and William awake at night, whispering worried conversations in the darkness of their bedroom. The transformation had been gradual at first, so subtle that they had dismissed it as typical childhood phases. Charlotte had always been strong-willed and independent, traits they had actually encouraged, believing them to be signs of a future leader. The first real sign that something was different came during a family dinner at Balmoral Castle. Charlotte had always been enthusiastic about royal traditions and family stories, often begging her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, to tell her tales about the crown jewels or the history of their ancestors. But that evening, when Catherine began sharing a story about Princess Diana's charitable work, Charlotte had looked up from her plate with an expression that chilled her mother to the bone. "Why do we have to pretend to care about people we don't even know?" Charlotte had asked, her voice carrying a coldness that seemed impossible from someone so young. "Why can't we just live our lives without all these fake smiles and boring visits to places that smell funny?" William had gently corrected her, explaining the importance of service and duty, but Charlotte had simply shrugged and returned to her meal, as if the conversation meant nothing to her. The dismissive gesture was so unlike the daughter they knew, the little girl who had once spent hours planning pretend charity events for her stuffed animals. As the weeks passed, more incidents followed. Charlotte began refusing to participate in family photos, claiming they were stupid and that she was tired of being stared at all the time. During a visit to a children's hospital, she had remained silent and stone-faced throughout the entire event, showing none of the natural warmth and curiosity that had made her previous public appearances so endearing. The situation escalated during a private family gathering when Charlotte's uncle, Prince Harry, was visiting from California with Meghan and their children. Charlotte had always been close to Harry, often giggling at his silly jokes and begging him to tell her stories about his adventures. But this time, when Harry tried to engage her in conversation, Charlotte had looked at him with what could only be described as contempt. "You left because you couldn't handle being royal," she had said matter-of-factly, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of someone much older and far more cynical. "Maybe I should leave too, since everyone here is just pretending to be happy anyway." The room had fallen into stunned silence. Meghan had looked uncomfortable, Harry had appeared genuinely hurt, and William had immediately ushered Charlotte away for a private conversation. But when they returned, Charlotte's demeanor hadn't changed. If anything, she seemed more defiant, as if she had finally spoken a truth that had been building inside her for months. Catherine found herself constantly analyzing every interaction, searching for clues about what had triggered this dramatic shift in her daughter's personality. Charlotte had always been observant and intelligent, perhaps too much so for her own good. Had she overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear? Had the pressure of royal life finally begun to weigh on her young shoulders in ways they hadn't anticipated? The princess tried everything she could think of to reach her daughter. She arranged special mother-daughter outings, hoping to create safe spaces where Charlotte might open up about whatever was troubling her. She bought books about famous strong women, thinking Charlotte might be inspired by stories of female leaders who had overcome challenges. She even consulted with child psychologists discreetly, desperate for professional insight into her daughter's behavior. but Charlotte remained distant and increasingly critical of everything around her. During a family visit to a local farm, an event that should have been fun and relaxed, Charlotte had complained loudly about the smell, the mud, and the pointless nature of the visit. When a young farmer's daughter had approached her excitedly, hoping to show Charlotte her prize-winning lamb, Charlotte had barely acknowledged the girl's enthusiasm. "This is all fake," Charlotte had whispered to her mother later. "We come here, pretend to care about their animals, take some pictures, and then leave. We don't actually help them or change anything. It's just a show." The accuracy of her observation was what made it so devastating. Charlotte was seeing through the carefully constructed world of royal duties with a clarity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. She was questioning the very foundation of their existence, the delicate balance between genuine care and public obligation that every member of the royal family had to navigate. William struggled with the situation in his own way, torn between his roles as a father and as a future king. He had always hoped that his children would embrace their heritage while maintaining normal, grounded childhoods. Seeing Charlotte reject everything he held dear felt like a personal failure, a sign that perhaps he and Catherine had somehow failed to properly prepare their daughter for the unique life she was born into. The media attention only made things worse. Photographers began capturing Charlotte's sullen expressions during public events, her reluctance to wave or smile. Royal correspondents started speculating about family tensions, wondering if the young princess was following in her Uncle Harry's footsteps by rejecting royal life. The comparisons to Harry were particularly painful for William, who was still processing his own complicated relationship with his brother. Catherine remembered one particularly difficult evening when she had found Charlotte sitting alone in her room, staring out the window at the gardens below. The little girl, who had once filled every moment with chatter and laughter, now seemed to prefer solitude, lost in thoughts that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. "Charlotte, sweetheart," Catherine had said gently, sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed. "Can you help me understand what you're feeling? I want to help, but I need to know what's wrong." Charlotte had turned to look at her mother with eyes that seemed ancient, filled with a wisdom and weariness that no child should possess. "Nothing's wrong, Mummy," she had said softly. "I just finally understand what's true and what's pretend, and I don't want to pretend anymore." The conversation had ended there, with Charlotte politely but firmly declining to elaborate further. Catherine had left the room feeling more helpless than ever, wondering how her bright, loving daughter had developed such a cynical view of their world at such a young age. Meanwhile, the palace staff began to notice changes in Charlotte's behavior during private moments as well. The nannies reported that she had become increasingly withdrawn, showing little interest in activities she had once enjoyed. Her tutors mentioned that while her academic performance remained excellent, she seemed disengaged and often made pointed comments about the relevance of her studies to her future role. One particularly concerning incident occurred during a private piano lesson. Charlotte had always loved music, often singing along enthusiastically and begging for extra practice time. But recently she had been approaching her lessons with mechanical precision, playing the notes correctly but without any joy or expression. When her instructor had gently asked if she was enjoying the piece they were working on, Charlotte had stopped playing and looked at her with that same unnervingly mature expression. "Does it matter if I enjoy it?" Charlotte had asked. "I have to learn it anyway because that's what princesses do. Everything we do is because we have to, not because we want to." The instructor had been so unsettled by the response that she had mentioned it to Catherine later, expressing concern about the young princess's apparent loss of enthusiasm for activities that should bring pleasure and fulfillment. As Charlotte's behavior continued to evolve, Catherine and William found themselves walking on eggshells around their own daughter, afraid that any mention of royal duties or family obligations might trigger another outburst or withdrawal. Family dinners became tense affairs, with Charlotte's brothers, George and Louis, seeming to sense the change in their sister's mood and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. The ripple effects of Charlotte's transformation were felt throughout the family dynamic. George, as the future heir, had always looked up to his sister's confidence and natural charisma. Seeing her reject the very things he was being prepared to embrace created confusion and uncertainty in his own young mind. Louis, the youngest, simply missed the playful, imaginative sister who had once led their games and adventures around the palace grounds. Catherine often found herself lying awake at night, replaying conversations and moments, searching for the exact point when everything had changed. Had it been the increased media attention as Charlotte grew older and more recognizable? Had she and William somehow failed to shield their daughter from the pressures and criticisms that came with royal life? Or was this simply Charlotte's natural personality asserting itself, a strong-willed individual rejecting a path that had been chosen for her before birth? The most heartbreaking aspect of the situation was that Charlotte's observations weren't wrong. The royal family did live a life that required constant performance, genuine emotions often filtered through the lens of public expectation and protocol. Catherine had spent years learning to navigate this balance, finding ways to maintain authenticity while fulfilling her duties. But explaining this complex reality to an 8-year-old who had suddenly decided she wanted nothing to do with pretense seemed impossible. Friends and family members began offering their own theories and advice. Some suggested that Charlotte was simply going through a phase that would pass with time and patience. Others wondered if professional counseling might help the young princess process her feelings about her unique circumstances. A few family members quietly suggested that perhaps Charlotte's honest assessment of royal life was something the family needed to hear, even if it was difficult to accept. As Catherine sat in her sitting room that morning, reading yet another speculative article about her daughter's concerning behavior, she realized that they were facing a crisis that went far beyond typical parenting challenges. Charlotte's transformation wasn't just affecting her as an individual. It was forcing the entire family to confront questions about the very nature of their existence, the price of privilege, and the cost of duty on young minds that were supposed to be carefree and innocent. The crisis deepened when Charlotte's school teachers requested an urgent meeting with Catherine and William, St. Thomas's Battersea. The private school where all 3 Cambridge children attended had always praised Charlotte for her academic excellence and natural leadership abilities. But recently, her teachers had noticed troubling changes that extended far beyond the walls of Kensington Palace. Mrs. Henderson, Charlotte's primary teacher, sat across from the royal couple in the headmaster's office, her usually warm demeanor replaced by genuine concern. She had taught hundreds of children over her 20-year career, but Charlotte's recent behavior had left her genuinely puzzled and worried. "Princess Charlotte has always been one of our most engaged students," Mrs. Henderson began carefully. "But over the past few weeks, she's been asking questions that are quite sophisticated for her age and, frankly, difficult to answer appropriately." She pulled out a folder containing some of Charlotte's recent work, including essays and classroom discussions that revealed the depth of her 8-year-old daughter's disillusionment. In a creative writing assignment about My Future Dreams, Charlotte had written a stark piece about a girl trapped in a golden cage, forced to smile and wave while her real thoughts remained hidden behind a mask. "She wrote that happiness is just another job requirement," Mrs. Henderson continued, reading from Charlotte's paper, "and that some people are born to be performers, not people. When I asked her to explain what she meant, she said that some families are businesses, not families." William felt his stomach drop as he listened to his daughter's words, reflected back to him through her teacher's concerned voice. The sophistication of Charlotte's observations was impressive, but the cynicism behind them was devastating. This wasn't typical childhood rebellion or a simple phase of questioning authority. Charlotte was systematically deconstructing everything that defined their family's purpose and identity. The meeting revealed more disturbing details about Charlotte's behavior at school. During history lessons about the British monarchy, Charlotte had begun offering commentary that made her classmates uncomfortable. When learning about Queen Victoria's long reign, Charlotte had suggested that the Queen probably hated every minute of her life but couldn't escape because duty is just a fancy word for prison. Her interactions with other children had also changed dramatically. Charlotte had always been popular among her peers, her natural confidence and kindness making her a favorite playmate. But recently, she had become increasingly isolated, often choosing to spend recess time alone rather than participating in group activities. When other children tried to include her in games, she would make comments about how their problems were small and temporary compared to hers, which were permanent and unfixable. Most concerning was an incident that had occurred during a class discussion about different types of families. When one child had mentioned that some families were famous or important, Charlotte had responded that being famous meant never being allowed to be yourself, and that important families were just regular families forced to pretend they were special. Her teacher had been struck by the bitterness in her young voice, a quality that seemed impossible in someone so young. The academic implications were becoming serious as well. Charlotte's grades remained excellent, but her teachers noted that she approached assignments with mechanical precision rather than genuine interest. Her creativity, once a standout quality, had taken on darker themes. Art projects featured images of birds in cages and flowers behind glass walls. Her poetry assignments consistently focused on themes of confinement and performance. Catherine listened to these revelations with growing alarm, realizing that Charlotte's transformation was more comprehensive than she had initially understood. This wasn't just about rejecting royal duties. Charlotte was questioning the fundamental nature of identity, authenticity, and freedom in ways that suggested a profound philosophical crisis in a mind far too young to be grappling with such concepts. The situation at school was further complicated by the other children's reactions to Charlotte's changed behavior. Some of her former friends had begun avoiding her, unsettled by her constant questioning of things they accepted without thought. Others seemed almost intimidated by her intensity, the way she could cut through comfortable illusions with observations that were painfully accurate but socially inappropriate for their age group. William found himself remembering his own childhood struggles with royal life, the moments when he had wished desperately for normalcy and privacy. But his rebellion had been more traditional, acting out through minor mischief and testing boundaries in typical ways. Charlotte's approach was far more intellectual and systematic, as if she had studied their entire existence and found it fundamentally flawed. After the school meeting, Catherine and William drove home in heavy silence, both processing the reality that their daughter's issues were affecting every aspect of her life. The carefully constructed world they had tried to create for their children, balancing royal responsibilities with normal childhood experiences, was crumbling under Charlotte's relentless questioning. That evening, they attempted another family dinner, hoping to create a relaxed atmosphere where Charlotte might feel comfortable opening up. But the meal became another exercise in walking on eggshells, with Charlotte's responses to simple questions revealing the depth of her disconnection from family life. When Louis excitedly shared news about a school project on community helpers, Charlotte had listened with that same distant expression before commenting that their family's helping was just elaborate photo opportunities that changed nothing for anyone. When George mentioned looking forward to an upcoming royal engagement, Charlotte had simply said that he would understand eventually how exhausting it was to pretend to care about strangers' problems. The most heartbreaking moment came when William, desperate to connect with his daughter, asked Charlotte what she would like to do if she could spend a day doing anything she wanted. For a brief moment, Charlotte's mask slipped, and they glimpsed the lonely, overwhelmed child beneath her precocious cynicism. "I want to be invisible," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. Just for one day, I want to go somewhere where no one knows who I am, where no one expects anything from me, where I can just be quiet and think my own thoughts without having to explain them to anyone." The raw honesty of her response left the entire family speechless. Catherine felt tears welling up as she realized how completely they had failed to understand the burden their daughter was carrying. Charlotte wasn't just rejecting royal life, she was desperately seeking space to discover who she was beneath the expectations and obligations that had defined her existence from birth. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Catherine and William had their most serious conversation yet about Charlotte's situation. They discussed the possibility of stepping back from certain royal duties to give their family more privacy and normalcy. They considered therapy options both for Charlotte individually and for the family as a whole. They even wondered aloud whether they should consult with Harry and Meghan, despite their complicated family dynamics, to understand how they had navigated similar feelings about royal life. But every potential solution seemed to come with its own set of complications. Reducing Charlotte's public exposure might provide temporary relief, but it wouldn't address her fundamental questions about the nature of their existence. Professional help might provide tools for coping, but Charlotte's observations about their life weren't symptoms of a psychological disorder. They were accurate assessments of a genuinely complex and constraining lifestyle. The next morning brought another challenge when Charlotte's nanny, Maria, approached Catherine with additional concerns. Maria had been with the family since George's birth and had developed a genuine affection for all three children, but she was struggling to know how to respond to Charlotte's increasingly philosophical questions about life, duty, and authenticity. "She asked me yesterday if I ever wished I had chosen a different job," Maria confided. "When I said that I love caring for your family, she said that at least I had chosen my life, while she had been assigned hers before she was born. She wanted to know if I thought that was fair." The conversation revealed another layer of Charlotte's thinking that her parents hadn't fully considered. Charlotte wasn't just questioning her own circumstances. She was developing a broader philosophy about choice, fate, and the fairness of inherited obligations. She was grappling with concepts that most people didn't seriously consider until adulthood, if ever. Maria also shared that Charlotte had been spending increasing amounts of time reading books far above her grade level, particularly biographies of historical figures who had rejected conventional paths. She had developed a particular fascination with people who had given up titles, wealth, or positions of power in pursuit of authenticity or personal freedom. "She asked me to help her find books about people who said no to important jobs," Maria explained. She wanted to know if anyone had ever successfully escaped from being famous without dying first. The morbid edge to Charlotte's question sent chills through Catherine. The idea that her 8-year-old daughter was already thinking about life in terms of escape routes and permanent solutions was terrifying. They were clearly dealing with a level of existential crisis that required immediate and careful intervention. Catherine began reaching out discreetly to child psychologists who specialized in gifted children and those dealing with unique life circumstances. She learned that children with high intelligence and unusual life situations could sometimes develop what professionals called existential depression, a profound questioning of life's meaning and purpose that typically didn't emerge until adolescence or adulthood. Dr. Juan Sarah Williams, a specialist in childhood development and family dynamics, agreed to meet with Catherine confidentially to discuss Charlotte's situation. During their conversation, Dr. Williams explained that children like Charlotte, who were both highly intelligent and living under extraordinary circumstances, could sometimes develop an accelerated awareness of life's complexities that their emotional development hadn't caught up with yet. "She's asking adult questions with a child's emotional resources," Dr. Williams explained. "Her observations about royal life aren't wrong, which makes it difficult to simply dismiss them as childhood misconceptions. She's seeing the contradictions and complexities that most people learn to accept gradually over many years. But she's encountering them all at once and at an age when she doesn't yet have the emotional tools to process them effectively. The doctor's assessment provided some clarity, but also highlighted the complexity of their situation. Charlotte wasn't simply being difficult or going through a phase. She was having a genuine philosophical and emotional crisis that required careful professional support. But any intervention would need to acknowledge the validity of her observations while helping her develop healthier ways to cope with the realities of her life. As Catherine left the appointment, she felt both relief and overwhelming sadness. Relief that there were professionals who could help them navigate this crisis, but sadness that her young daughter was struggling with questions and feelings that no child should have to face. The transformation that had begun with small changes in Charlotte's behavior had evolved into a fundamental crisis of identity and purpose that threatened to reshape their entire family's future. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way, during what would later become known in the family as the Museum Incident. Catherine had planned a private visit to the Victoria and Albert Museum, hoping that exposing Charlotte to art and history in a pressure-free environment might reignite some spark of curiosity or joy. The museum had been cleared of other visitors for their safety, creating the kind of artificial environment that Charlotte had come to despise. As they walked through the galleries, Charlotte maintained her usual distant demeanor, mechanically looking at exhibits without showing any real interest. Catherine's heart sank as she watched her daughter go through the motions of engagement, wondering if they would ever again see genuine enthusiasm from the little girl who had once found magic in everything around her. But then Charlotte stopped abruptly in front of a particular painting, a portrait of a young Victorian girl in an elaborate dress, her expression serious and somewhat melancholy. The placard identified her as Lady Elizabeth Cavendish, painted when she was 9 years old, just 1 year older than Charlotte herself. Something about the girl's eyes captured Charlotte's attention in a way that nothing had for months. "She looks sad," Charlotte said softly, the first unprompted observation she had made all day. "Even though she's wearing a beautiful dress and probably lived in a fancy house, she looks like she wants to be somewhere else." Catherine approached carefully, afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell of Charlotte's engagement. "What do you think she was thinking about when this was painted?" Charlotte studied the portrait intently, her young face serious with concentration. "I think she was thinking about what it would be like to choose her own clothes and go outside without asking permission. I think she was wondering if anyone would still love her if she wasn't a perfect lady all the time." The words hung in the air between them, and Catherine realized that Charlotte wasn't just describing the girl in the painting. She was finally articulating her own deepest fears and desires. For the first time in months, her daughter was opening up about the weight she had been carrying. "Do you think she was lonely?" Catherine asked gently, sitting on a nearby bench and inviting Charlotte to join her. Charlotte nodded slowly, still staring at the painting. "I think she was lonely even when she was with other people, because she couldn't be herself around them. Like me at school now. Everyone treats me differently because of who my family is, and when I try to say what I really think, it makes them uncomfortable." This was the conversation Catherine had been hoping for, praying for, during all those sleepless nights. Charlotte was finally beginning to put words to the complex emotions that had been driving her transformation. The cynicism and rejection hadn't been rooted in simple rebellion. They had been protective mechanisms for a child who felt fundamentally misunderstood and isolated. "Tell me more about feeling lonely," Catherine encouraged, careful to keep her voice neutral and supportive. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her words revealed a level of emotional sophistication that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "Everyone thinks being a princess means wearing pretty dresses and having people take your picture and getting to meet famous people," Charlotte said slowly. But it really means never being able to just be yourself. Even when I'm home, I have to think about how everything I do might look to other people later. I have to be careful about what I say and how I act because someone might write about it in a newspaper. Catherine felt her heart breaking as she listened to her daughter articulate feelings that she herself had struggled with throughout her own adjustment to royal life. But hearing these concerns from an 8-year-old made them seem even more tragic and overwhelming. "I see George getting excited about becoming king someday," Charlotte continued. "And I want to tell him that it's not going to be as wonderful as he thinks. But then I remember that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm just not good at being royal like everyone else in our family." The self-doubt in Charlotte's voice was devastating. Catherine realized that her daughter hadn't just been rejecting royal life. She had been questioning her own worth and ability to fulfill expectations that she saw as fundamentally impossible to meet authentically. "Charlotte," Catherine said gently, "there's nothing wrong with you. These feelings you're having, these questions you're asking, they're not signs that you're failing at being royal. They're signs that you're thinking deeply about very complicated things." For the first time in months, Charlotte turned to look directly at her mother, and Catherine saw tears beginning to form in her daughter's eyes. The carefully constructed wall of cynicism and detachment was finally beginning to crack. "But what if I can never be happy doing the things our family has to do?" Charlotte asked, her voice small and vulnerable. "What if I always feel like I'm pretending? What if I grow up and still feel like that girl in the painting, trapped in a beautiful life that isn't really mine?" The question contained layers of fear that went far beyond typical childhood concerns. Charlotte was grappling with fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and the possibility of finding genuine happiness within the constraints of her inherited role. She was facing, at 8 years old, the kind of existential crisis that might drive someone to make drastic life changes. Catherine chose her words carefully, knowing that this moment could determine whether Charlotte began to heal or retreated even further into her protective shell of cynicism. "I think that girl in the painting, and you, and everyone in our family deserves to find a way to be themselves while also serving others," Catherine said. "It's not easy, and it takes time to figure out how to do both things, but I don't think you have to choose between being real and being royal." Charlotte considered this for a moment, her gaze shifting between her mother and the portrait. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending?" The question was direct and challenging, demanding honesty rather than comfortable platitudes. Catherine realized that Charlotte needed to hear truth, not reassurance. "Yes," Catherine admitted. "Sometimes I do feel like I'm performing rather than just being myself. But I've also learned that serving others, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, can be a way of being true to my values. It's taken me years to find the balance, and I'm still learning." This honest admission seemed to provide Charlotte with something she had been desperately seeking: validation that her feelings were normal and that the adults in her life struggled with similar challenges. The revelation that even her mother, who seemed so perfectly suited to royal life, sometimes felt the same internal conflicts was both comforting and liberating. Over the following weeks, Charlotte began opening up more frequently, sharing her observations and concerns rather than keeping them locked inside. The conversations were often difficult and sometimes painful, but they represented genuine communication rather than the polite distance that had characterized their interactions for months. Dr. Williams began working with Charlotte individually, helping her develop tools for managing the complex emotions that came with her unique circumstances. The therapy focused not on changing Charlotte's perceptions, which were often accurate, but on helping her find healthy ways to cope with realities that couldn't be changed. One of the most significant developments was Charlotte's growing ability to distinguish between the aspects of royal life that were genuinely problematic and those that were simply different from what other children experienced. With professional support, she began to see that her life contained both genuine constraints and unusual opportunities, and that she could acknowledge both without falling into despair. The family also made significant changes to support Charlotte's emotional needs. They reduced her public appearances to essential events only, giving her more time to simply be a child without the pressure of performance. They established regular family meetings where all three children could express concerns or feelings about their unique circumstances without judgment. Most importantly, they began having honest conversations about the realities of royal life, acknowledging its difficulties rather than pretending that their existence was purely privileged and happy. This transparency helped Charlotte feel less isolated in her struggles and gave her brothers better preparation for their own future challenges. Charlotte's relationship with her schoolmates also began to improve as she learned to share her thoughts in ways that were less overwhelming for her peers. Dr. Williams helped her understand that her insights about life and society were valuable, but that 8-year-olds weren't necessarily ready for deep philosophical discussions about duty and authenticity. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Charlotte continued to struggle with questions about identity and purpose, and there were still difficult days when the weight of her future responsibilities felt overwhelming. But she was no longer carrying these burdens alone, and she had begun to develop a more nuanced understanding of her situation. Perhaps most significantly, Charlotte began to show signs of her old enthusiasm returning, though tempered by a new maturity and self-awareness. She became interested in learning about historical figures who had successfully balanced personal authenticity with public service, finding inspiration in people who had navigated similar challenges. The crisis that had initially seemed to threaten Charlotte's future happiness and the family's stability ultimately became an opportunity for growth and deeper understanding. While Charlotte would always be more thoughtful and questioning than many of her peers, she was learning to channel those qualities into positive directions rather than allowing them to isolate her from the world around her. Catherine and William emerged from the experience with a deeper appreciation for the unique challenges their children faced and a commitment to supporting their individual personalities rather than expecting them to fit predetermined molds. Charlotte's transformation had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also taught them valuable lessons about the importance of authenticity, communication, and emotional support within their extraordinary circumstances. The little girl, who had once charmed the world with her innocent enthusiasm, had grown into a more complex individual, but one who was learning to find her own path within the constraints and opportunities of her inherited role. The journey toward balance and happiness would be ongoing, but Charlotte now had the tools and support she needed to navigate it successfully.